Good morning, Propenomix people, and good morning, Propenomix people. Hello, and welcome to another Sunday Supplement Live. And this week, I'm talking about housing completions and the impending meltdown, especially in the London market, but more realistically around the country in terms of the collapse in new build starts and completions, and basically what's going to leave Labour's dream, and it is a pipe dream, we always knew that, of 1.5 million homes during this parliament in absolute tatters, unfortunately. So if you've listened before, you'll know that I like to start with a quote. And this week's is, the decline in output has been caused by multiple factors that go beyond planning policy. That's from the Home Builders Federation. And what that pertains to is what, unfortunately, I've been saying all along since the wonderfully ambitious targets came out from the Labour Party last year when they won the election, in that fixing planning does not fix the entire system. And you can't just keep ratcheting up regulation and expect things to business as usual to continue. There's this sort of mega assumption that property developers make all this incredible money. And look, they made brilliant money during the 2010s, mostly because money was so very, very cheap. And there were things like the Help to Buy equity scheme in place. So it's really a perfect storm upwards for development. Now, today, in today's 2025 and beyond world, you've got way more regulation to be involved with building, and you've got expensive money, apart from anything else. And there's loads more, and I'm going to get into it all today. But before I really get started on this soapbox in significant ways, that quote really is all about the deep dive part. And we're going to look at the UK housing market from multiple angles. But as the calendar creeps towards a new year, it's a natural time to pause and tackle the biggest challenges that keep small to medium enterprise property businesses from achieving true sustainable growth. For most, this boils down to two core areas: laying a bulletproof strategic plan for the next 12 months, and finally cracking the code on financial measurement and accountability. If you've ever felt lost in a sea of bookkeeping data, or if your productivity methods are falling short, it's time to switch from doing to leading and truly understand how your assets are performing. Book in on our next property business workshop with myself and Rob Turner. It's Thursday, the 22nd of January at a central London location. And the link to follow is in the show notes, and it's also bit.ly/PBW and the number 9. So I always kick these off with Trumpwatch and what the day traders call the taco. The taco trade, that's Trump always chickens out. And indeed, after the meltdown in the markets on Friday, the 10th of October, particularly those eye-watering losses in what are kindly called lesser crypto assets, the taco trade seems to be alive and well. The Donald confirmed he is, in fact, meeting President Xi in the coming weeks, and that his floated 100% China tariffs are not sustainable. The markets responded positively. The party line is still reciprocal, tariffs based on trade balances, which are not reciprocal, of course, but nonetheless, they are easy enough to understand. The S&P is trading about 23 times forward earnings per share. It's the highest multiple in about 5 years. Now, the wisdom of this seems questionable, but there's been chatter in the markets about being overbought for at least a couple of years now, and the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent, particularly with an irrational actor having such a huge influence on the markets. Then politically, the development of the Abraham Accords is back on the table, continuing its peace and stability in the Middle East project. Meanwhile, the 20-point plan has stalled, and that's being kind. For those who observe that Hamas have a limited amount of gain left by the time we've considered the release swap, you can't argue with the veracity of that ultimately. What political pressure is being put where by Trump or Washington is anybody's guess, to be honest. That's probably one that's likely best kept off Truth Social as much as possible. Now, in the Trump 2.0 presidency, that largely represents a really quiet week. What a world we live in these days. Anyway, back to our homeland and the UK real-time property market. Chris Watkin dunks another one. Week 40. I can't believe we're 40 weeks of data through the year, which means we're 41 weeks through the year already. Unbelievable pace things go at these days. Listings printed 32,700, down 1,700 on last week. The market starts that little slowdown towards the end of the year. My ready reckoner of 10% more stock than a normal market is still working. We've had a couple of years of historical overperformance in listings compared to what's been sold, compared to what's been cleared out, and that's led to us having more stock. We've had 1.44 million homes listed this year, for example, on the UK market. So we're 10.2% ahead of the 9-year average, although bear in mind that includes 2020. But we're really inching back towards those 2024 numbers now, week by week, because we were 6 to 7% ahead of them. We started the year like a bullet. And of course, some of that was maybe the stamp cliff, but realistically, you don't list your house in January if you think it's going to complete by March if you're in the normal and open market. So it has tracked back from that 6 or 7% to 2.2% ahead of the 2024 listings now, but we're still 10% ahead of the 2017 to 19 average listings. We actually listed 7.8% fewer houses in week 40 of this year than we did in week 40 of 2024, and very nearly the same number that we did in week 40 of 2023. But we're still well ahead of those pre-pandemic listings for week 40s, of course. So puts it all back into context, a bit of a wave that we're riding, as you can see. Price reductions in week 40, 24,600. So September's completed number for price reductions was back to 14.1%. August 11.1 looks like a bit of a blip, maybe too many people on holiday. Or agents sensibly said, look, don't reduce in August, save that price reduction for the beginning of September, which is good advice for their clients probably. And that 14% is a number we've seen, 14.1 in July, 14% in June. This year's average is 13.2% reduced, but that 5-year average is 10.7. So way more reduced properties than a normal market. Now, you could argue the first half of that 5 years wasn't a normal market either. And I think you'd have a point, but we don't have data beyond the 5 years. So I'm afraid that's the best we've got. We're reducing about 25% more properties than we normally would be in a normal market. And we've got more on the market. So there's over 100,000 price reductions in the last month in the UK. So please don't tell me you can't find any deals out there. How many sold subject to contract? 24,800, so healthy enough. Average for this year, 26,100. Week 40s on average print, 24,800, so we're smack on the 9-year average. And that wouldn't be a problem, that 9-year average, because ultimately we're talking about October, so COVID effects would have washed out largely by then, I would have thought, for sold subjects. It's not like the market was closed in October 2020, is what I mean. Sold subjects are up 5.1% year on year, but remember, those listings are only up 2.2, so we're still at there's still more intention to transact in 2025 than there was 12 months ago, even if those deals don't go through, but we have achieved more net sales as well, which I'll come on to. Now, 1st of October, we had 751,797 homes on the market. That was up about 15,000 in September. Looking at these listing numbers, you're going to expect that to just creep upwards again in October. Will it reach the 763,000 that we saw in August? I'm not sure that it will, to be honest. I think that might be our cycle peak. That's where my money would be. For a bit of more context there, before the pandemic, that number was about 660,000 as a general rule. If you've got fewer than 600,000 pieces of stock on the market, you're really talking about a seller's market, a pretty hot market, because supply is really restricted there. So we need about 650-ish thousand to have a normal functioning market. And if we go a long way, 10%, I would say, either side of that, it starts to impact things. And the more we go away from that mean, of course, the more it starts to impact things. At the end of September 2024, there was 723,000 on the market. So we're only about 30,000 ahead of that. So as I say, we're not doing much more now than we were last year. As a general rule, the market still looks loosely the same, although there's more transactions going on. Only 4% more transactions on the market, basically, on October the 1st this year compared to last year. But the 2024 number was already the 8-year high, so please bear that in mind. There's also the sold subjects per square foot, which Chris likes to look at. September square foot pricing, sales agreed, 336.54, lower again, right? So previous numbers for context, August 338.78, which was only 1.4% up on a year earlier and only 14.25% up on August 2020. But that was down 2.2 on June's number, which was 346.45. So that 346.45 is our high for the moment. And that's a fairly dramatic drop back to 336.54, right? I still think we'll see 1.5 to 2% in the books for the land reg by the time the ONS get round in February to telling us what December's figures were. for the housing market in Feb 26. That's the yardstick that I always use for the real movement in the market, because a lot of the commentators talk about asking prices and they use their own data, which is not as sufficient as all of the HMRC data that the ONS uses. Of course, they have all the data, particularly for houses that have traded over £40,000, of course, but the Land Reg have actually got all the data, but they rely on HMRC for the figures, of course, which makes sense, right? So, June to September, actually, that's a haircut of 2.9%. Haven't seen anybody talking about that in the broader marketplace, realistically, but that really is very significant. And we'll probably see that manifest itself in a difficult Q1 2026 as far as the Land Reg goes. So we're going to be starting the year behind the 8 ball, probably, in terms of how much property is going to grow or not next year. But I still have my bullish considerations around how much easier it is for first-time buyers to borrow more money. Because remember, they can borrow £28,000 on average, according to the big banks, more than they could at the start of 2025. So that's before we consider any wage rises they might have had. And largely speaking, the 2-year mortgage rate is more favourable, and first-time buyers do like 2-year mortgage rates because they go in thinking, well, we might move in 2 years, usually a bit over-optimistic, but they don't really want to commit to 5 years in their first property, which is quite sensible. Fair few first-time buyers do move before they've done 5 years in their first property, so you can understand it. And also, I would argue perhaps the industry pushes them into 2-year rather than 5-year, but that's a slightly different soapbox that I haven't been on for a while. What about net sales then and fall-throughs? Well, fall-throughs printed 25.3. It's still very close to that long-term average of 24.2. I don't see anything in these little 1% movements here and there, to be honest. You're more looking for the trend, really, and the trend is around the average and has been for weeks and weeks and weeks now, and it will be in a stable market, right? Net sales 18,500, 4.3% up on last year, 10% higher than 17 to 19. Not quite 2022 levels yet, but we're only 400 net sales behind for the year. So we know we're going to absolutely blow past that as the post-Liz Truss 2022 era kicks in to spoil the 2022 figures. So we'll end up with more net sales in 25 than we did in 22, even though 22 had 6 to 7 months of still being a really, really quite warm market. It was still white hot at the turn of the year, cooled, was already cooling, then the lettuce. We know what happened then. Week 40, 9-year average for net sales, 18.2k. So just ahead of that number, still looking pretty healthy. I always give Chris this weekly shout out because he's much more prolific than just this epic tome he releases weekly on the UK property market. Comes up with some great stats on a regular basis. So please drop him a like, a subscribe, all the rest of it. Some kind words for his content creation. And if you're in the habit of dropping likes and subscribes and comments, please leave me one as well on all fronts if you're not already subscribing on YouTube to the Propenomix supplement. Thank you. Chris's core business is to make you a more effective communicator, make you more in touch with your local market, and to be able to communicate that to your clients and your potential clients, right? That's his core business. If that fits you, if you fit that bill, make sure you give Chris a shout. You can also go and check his article out on the Property Industry Eye website on a weekly basis, and his video content goes on his YouTube channel at Christopher Watkin. And also follow him on socials, LinkedIn, for example. He's absolutely great with some of the stuff that he posts, and you'll often catch me reposting it with Chris's permission, of course. So, what's in this week's macro rotation? Meat week, I normally call this week, but it's actually split over 2 weeks this month. So we have to make do with the labour market and unemployment, and then the growth figures, and then I've been able to squeeze in the statutory homelessness stats for Q2 2025. And then last up, the gilts and swaps, of course. I was so enthusiastic last week about the intergalactic waste of taxpayer money that is the quantitative tightening strategy from the Bank of England that I actually missed reporting on the gilts and swaps for the first time in about 3 years. That won't happen again. Well, the rant about quantitative tightening inevitably will happen again until they change what they're doing, but the missing of the gilts and swaps won't, and that much I promise you. So, labour market report contains some big news. The first month for some time that suggested we did not go backwards in terms of job numbers. 10,000 were added month on month in terms of payroll jobs for the first time since January. Yes, every other month has been job shedding. And March to May were particularly bloody around that employers' national insurance rise in April, of course. I've said it many times, but you make it more expensive to employ people. And what do companies do? They employ fewer people. It's really not rocket science. It's basic economics, right? And then January was also a bit of an anomaly because there was plenty of shedding before January. So is this just another anomaly? And 10,000 is not a lot in the jobs world, right? 50,000 is a lot. 100,000 is really significant. 10,000 is not a lot in the UK jobs market, right? There's 35 million people in employment, so puts it into context for you. Even 100,000 is only 0.33% of that, of course. So there were 93,000 payroll jobs lost between August 2024 and August 2025. So it's 10% of that coming back, 11% of that coming back. But I'm worried about this being an anomaly. We still lost 31,000 jobs in this past quarter. They also always do a nowcast kind of estimate for September, but the nowcast normally is an understatement. It's normally pretty bearish. The nowcast for September, 10,000 jobs lost. So hopefully there'll be a reversal on that and we can try and hit 2 positive months in a row for job creation, which is just woeful. And strangely enough, this is how politics works. This is how the Overton window works. There's not a lot being said about jobs and the job market. And you could say, look, that is because unemployment is still pretty low. 6% was the magic number. Getting below 6% in the middle of the last decade was heralded as a time when we could bring the interest rate back up to normal and do this, that, and the other. And that soon evaporated. Brexit came along, the referendum and all the rest of it. That changed the path of interest rates as well. But the Labour don't seem to be getting any telling off in the press, and people just aren't worried about unemployment. Perhaps it's just because there's not that much unemployment out there. But if you've been here before with me when I discuss these stats, I prefer the big picture, right? The employment rate, that's 16 to 64s, which is 75.1%. The unemployment rate, that's over 16s, but that means they're seeking a job, with 4.8%, and that's up 0.1. And that's the one that always makes the headlines. And then inactivity, that's 16 to 64 again, 21%. So those age boundaries are the reason why those three stats don't add up to 100%, which is very frustrating. And why we talk 16 to 64 when you don't get a pension until 67 these days, don't ask me, don't know, right? But vacancies also give you a good snapshot picture. I like looking at the vacancies, and the snapshot continues to be a looser labour market. The 39th consecutive period, that's unprecedented, by the way, with dropping vacancy numbers, but happily only 9,000 this time out to 717,000. That's 78,000 fewer job vacancies than quarter one of 2020, which of course is the pre-pandemic yardstick. So did that clip the wings of earnings? You'd think it would start to, but not so much, right? Excluding bonus, wages are still up 4.7%, and wages including bonuses are still up 5%. Breaking back to 4.4% for the private sector and 6% for the public sector, which is always a source of annoyance in the rare periods when this does happen. But if you adjust for CPIH, which is the measure of inflation the ONS prefers, CPI including housing costs, basically, much more like the American CPI, the real pay growth is 0.6 or 0.9% if we adjust for the wider used CPI, and then 1.2 if we use the real pay including bonus. But it's still pretty miserable. Right. Now, in August, we only lost 15,000 days to labour disputes as people went on holiday instead of strike, I'd imagine, because that's been a low figure for the last few years. There's an element here of me throwing my own experience into the mixer as well, because I'm currently recruiting for a position within my core team. Normally, when that's happening, I take control of that process. And a similar position was advertised with a similar rate of pay. It's been adjusted up a little bit just because of the time taken 18 months ago. 18 months ago, I could find enthusiasm, potential, and I ended up with a great candidate. There was a significant amount of industry-specific training required. Today, 3 or 4 really solid applicants in the past week with varying degrees of experience in the property industry, some of which are extensive, and indeed some of which are more than mine in terms of years. All of them aside from one, those 3 or 4, recently made redundant. I don't remember speaking to one single redundant candidate or seeing a CV from a redundant candidate 18 months ago. The difference is absolutely stark. Across all the other businesses I'm involved in, we've made 8 staff redundant this year, and we employ around about 100 all told, all with an economic gun to our head to preserve the viability of the business and everybody else's jobs ultimately. So, for the first time I can remember in a while, the employment rate is also down on the quarter. So I have made this point before, right? The inactivity rate has been coming down. Is that because Labour have been better at controlling waiting lists than the Conservatives? Difficult to say. The numbers aren't actually as damning as someone like Wes Streeting would hope that they would be. The waiting lists were already coming down under Sunak, right, for the last sort of 9 months, I think, of Sunak's tenure, if I recall correctly. They were actually on the way downwards, and they've carried on the way downwards. Have they carried on in a more accelerated fashion? Not from any graphs that I've seen as yet. So it's just a continuing trend to an extent. Although I do believe that Labour put more importance on this stuff than the Conservative Party. You have to see it in the figures, don't you, to believe it. So they've had to absorb many of the longer term sick who've come back to the labour market, for example. Now, other people who were inactive have come back as well. Let's say, I think this is quite a significant one at the moment. You were mid-50s, kids had grown up, or you didn't have kids, you were working super hard, the pandemic came, bang, it stopped you in your tracks, you maybe had a bit of furlough, or you just decided there was more to life, and you thought, well, I can squeeze into early retirement here. Then what happened? Inflation happened, and it's still happening, right? And that's going to bring you back to the job market. And looking at all the hires that are being made, people are still paying and want senior hires in white-collar jobs that are using more and more AI, apart from anything else. It's the junior hiring rate that's dropped through the floor, but that holds true for graduates and for non-graduates as well. So there's just a move against younger people. Why were so many younger people employed before? Because they were quite a bit cheaper in a lot of industries like hospitality. Now they're not cheaper. What happens? You just go for someone who's a bit older. It's just the fact of the matter, I'm afraid, in terms of what we're seeing in the figures, right? So inactivity is down dramatically, but this quarter there's been no change in inactivity, but there has been a 0.2% drop in the employment rate. So employment down 0.2, unemployment up 0.2. Inactivity at 21 is quite a bit better than it was in some of the years earlier in this decade. Now, the economist consensus was we'd stay at 4.7 on unemployment, but we hit 4.8. And every little 0.1 worries people more and more, because I believe when that 5% barrier is crossed, and I think it will be crossed, it will be a psychologically interesting one in terms of the politics. Okay, on to growth. We had some. The smallest number, though, 0.1, in line with expectations for August. Now, there's some pretty mind-blowing stuff in this growth report that I'm going to get to at the end, but let's just go through the motions of what the ONS decided we should read in the headlines, first of all. So, that 0.1 largely in context with the PMIs of August and with the 0.1 loss the month before. Now, that was a revision downwards from 0 to minus 0.1 for July this year, right? Sideways, sideways, and sideways, right? This growth report giveth and it taketh away in equal quantity. Still breaks back to 1.3% growth this year, which is far, far better than you'd think if you only listen to the misery on social media and the wider media as it goes. Now, please note, I'm not saying that Labour are doing a good job. It's more of a fact that luckily the economy largely keeps calm and carries on, regardless of what idiocy is going on at number 10 and number 11. Lettuce and other salad items aside, of course. So, the 3-month number, 0.3% growth. Services up 0.4, but clipped back by production output down 0.3. Unlike the PMIs, construction output was up 0.3, which also grew the quarter before. We've had 9 months below the 50 handle. Again, to note, this isn't resi building activity, which I'll get into at a seriously deep length to this week in the deep dive, right? The monthly numbers were different as production grew by 0.4, construction fell by 0.3, which is more in line with the terrible PMI handle for August, and services remained static. What did well? Well, in services, human health activities and also rental and leasing activities that were up 5.3 on the month. Arts, entertainment and recreation shrank 2.4 on the month by contrast. Services overall, however, have not grown for 2 months on the spin. There's a current streak of 6 quarters in a row of positive services growth. That's at risk for Q3 of 2024, it seems. Construction continues to confound the PMIs in terms of the official government figures, but the growth is in repair and maintenance, it seems. New work was indeed down in the 3 months to August 2025, and on its own, repair and maintenance was the only quarterly positive. But it was so far forwards that it carried the rest of the sector, including a public housing repair and maintenance sector that shrank over 0.4% in the quarter. Where was the specific weakness in August in construction? Glass, cement, plaster, concrete, iron, steel and wood. basically every single construction material, right? UK cement production levels in August fell to a 75-year low. And you can probably do the maths to say that was 1950, right? So, as always, just evidencing why it is clear to go through the reports in a level of detail, that the bit that didn't make the headlines, buckle up, right? The revisions since the last monthly release, which was the 12th of September. GDP has been edited, trimmed by minus 0.1 in July. That made the headline, remember, but also by minus 0.1 in January, February, March, and April. The only mitigation was a 0.1 revision upwards for May. So on balance, rounded, that makes a minus 0.4% adjustment, which is about £11.2 billion revision downwards to GDP. What implication does that have on the tax take? About £4.25 billion the wrong way before a horrible budget. Bad luck doesn't really cover it for Rachel here, and Donald Trump will be firing people left, right and centre at the ONS. But how does this stuff not get reported? I know, even though that was a rhetorical question, people don't bother to read the report, they just read the headlines. But I feel that not putting this in the bullets is a little duplicitous by the ONS report writers, to be honest. I think they just tried to bury it. Anyway, mini rant over. On to the MHCLG homelessness stats. They're better news than there was in 2024, for sure. In Q2 of 2025, the number of households with an initial homelessness assessment was only 86,370, but that's down 6.7% from quarter 2 of 2024. We have to look quarter on year because of seasonal effects, apart from anything else. A further 36,200 were assessed as being threatened with homelessness, which was also down 4.6%. 6,530 of these were down to Section 21s, a vastly lower percentage actually than is often advertised by the lobby groups, 18%. And that number of Section 21s was down 8.7% from quarter 4 to quarter 2, 2024. So perhaps much of the Renters' Rights Bill serving of Section 21 is done, it seems, before it becomes an act. I guess we'll see. Or it's maybe just because rents aren't screaming upwards, some lobby groups would claim. So there's not many reasons to move this on. But of course, remember, Section 21 was going to be banned from day one. That was Angela Rayner's chat during the election campaign. So that would be why an awful lot of Section 21s were served in quarter 2, 2024. When you think about the timeline, right? Now, 42,470 households were assessed as homelessness and owed a relief duty, which again was down 9.4% from quarter 2, 2024, sorry. Those with children decreased 12.6% from quarter 2 last year, happily, but still numbered 11,000. However, the nasty bit that only makes the final paragraph of the summary, the report opens with the great news that those presenting as homeless has fallen quarter on year. The number of households in temporary accommodation as at the 30th of June 2025 was still at a record level, 7.6% increase, and households with children were up 7.5% to 84,240. Single households were up 7.9% to 48,170. The first thought here might be why? Well, let me explain it to you. The speed at which people are coming into the top of the funnel has been slowed down, which is great news. But the amount of people coming to the top is still exceeding the number of people managing to get out the bottom of the funnel in a timely fashion, unfortunately. 36,160 presented with a prevention duty, right, so prevent them from, so they weren't actually homeless, it was about helping them, preventing from becoming homeless. And 35,410 saw their prevention duty end. Right, so more presented with a duty than had that duty end. But of course, the end of the prevention duty is not necessarily that we're all sorted. It might just be a move of duty. I know these stats are a little bit complicated, right? But main duty homelessness assessment breakdown for quarter 2 is illuminating, right? 25,090 decisions were made. 16,440 were accepted as homeless with a priority need, and unintentionally homeless. 65.5% of assessments. 1,080 were judged as intentionally homeless. 7,350 were assessed as having no priority need. 220 were assessed as not homeless. And then in London, the temporary accommodation rate, 2.03% of households are in temporary. 1 in 50 households in London is in temporary accommodation. That compares to 0.28% in the rest of England. Right? So it's about 8 to 9 times higher, the rate of temporary accommodations per household in London than the rest of England. Newham hit 5.9% in quarter 2 2025, and Slough was the highest outside London. Many people would still argue it's ultimately part of London these days, especially with things like the Elizabeth line being built. They've got 2.48% of people in temporary. It's just eye-watering stats. But some good news. Whilst 14,250 households were still living in B&Bs by the end of quarter 2 this year, that was down 22.4% on last year. So that's now 10.8% of households who are in TA, down from 15. Households with dependent children were down 43.5%, but still represent 23.4% of households in B&Bs. The government's stated goal is to end this by the end of the Parliament. It's one of the few things that I really like about them. Let's hope they can do it. They made some really, really good progress there, but they've got to kick on. Now, of the 3,340 households that have been in B&B for the longer than there is a statutory limit, which many people don't know, of 6 weeks in a B&B, right? 2,070 of them have been there longer. That's in London, right? So the peak was 3,770. So again, we're seeing a reasonable speed in the right direction here. Now, next up, there's a sentence that only a government report can deliver. The most common length of time for households with children to have spent in temporary accommodation is 2 to 5 years. 18,940 of the households with children in temporary at the moment, 22.5%. 32.6% are in nightly paid self-contained accommodation. Adult-only households remain in TA for less than 6 months, on the other hand, which is more than any other category. So adult-only still seems to work reasonably well. With children, it just doesn't. Why? There's nowhere for them to go. Ultimately, that's the problem. The move on accommodation is just not there in anywhere near the volume that it needs to be. Now, 42,080 households in TA were in accommodation in a different local authority district. Right, 0.17% of households in England are in a TA unit in an out-of-area run placement. Right, and 81.5% of these placements were from London authorities, which probably won't surprise you. Other out-of-area placement hotspots outside of London originated from Manchester City Council, Oadby and Wigston Borough Council, and Adder District Council. So 86.3% of out-of-area is within the same region, and therefore 13.7% is not. So percentage-wise, the worst offenders for out-of-region placements are Yorkshire and the Humber, the east of England and the southeast, who all place between 19 and 20% of all their temporary placements outside of the region itself, so a move of region. Now, I appreciate there could be, if you lived on the border of one of the regions, that might skew the stats a little bit, but I don't think it skews them significantly enough. We are talking a whole region, ultimately. But what was the most common reason for homelessness assessed as being owed a prevention duty in quarter 2 2025? End of AST. Why? Landlord wishes to sell or re-let, which they then make distinctly different from landlord wishing to sell, which they then make distinctly different from landlord wishing to re-let the property. I wonder who's answering that question, though. Is it the tenant, the landlord, or the council? The most common age bracket of the lead applicant was 25 to 34, representing 27.6% of the applicants, followed by 35 to 44, which was another 25.3%. 1.4% were over 75, and 0.6% were 16 or 17. Every category actually fell in number, apart from 65 to 74s and 75s and over. 36.5% of lead applicants were unemployed, but the next largest category was those in full-time work at 12.4%. It's always such a sobering report, but the numbers need to be shared, they need to be discussed, they need to be talked about, and there needs to be awareness of them. So, moving on with the gilts and swaps, we had a happier week here, somewhat because US bond yields have been trending downwards, with the US 10-year making some real progress. Tuesday morning's unexpected tick upwards in the unemployment figures, which I've already discussed, did us no real harm on the gilt yields. 5-year gilt opened the week last week at 4.128% yield, and closed it at 3.983, nearly 15 basis points down. We'll take that. Thursday's close was even better at 3.956. That Thursday close translated into a 5-year swap of 3.617, lower than 1 month ago at 3.732 and 1 year ago at 3.669, but stable, as I've been saying for some time. A turn up on recent weeks though. 30-year also down about 15 basis points this week, actually about 15.1, down from 5.494 to 5.343, which looks a bit more reasonable for the 30-year bond. But the yield curve stays roughly the same shape, but it's still starkly steeper than it was 12 months ago. So I'm pricing new mortgage debt expectations around 5.6% today, once you've included fees and all the rest of it, which leaves yields needing to be 7%, or a little lighter for those who manage themselves or have got very tight cost bases, or 8% plus for those with larger and more layered operations. Okay, the gilt section, and this week's activity leads us to a two-pronged deep dive. First up, housing starts and the lack of progress, particularly in London. There have been a few illuminating reports this week, which I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of. I'm also going to discuss the Bank of England speeches that have been taking place, since it's clear, as usual, that some members of the committee are in different places to others. It's almost a case of where do you start? Thanks especially to one supplement reader who sent me a copy of the Molly Orr report for Q3 on residential development in London. It paints such a stark picture covering schemes of 20 or more homes. It starts with context. Between 2015 and 2020, there were 60 to 65,000 homes for private sale or rent under construction in London at any one given time. Today, that's 40,000. 5,300 of those have actually halted their part built. The Molly Orr forecast is that due to substantial completions expected in 2026, the number will be 15,000 to 20,000 by the 1st of January 2027. That's under construction. Their push is for the government to remove unnecessary development costs or adjust stamp duty. I see zero chance of the latter just yet. The government will just try and cover it up and blame the Tories come 2027, which will be too late and too long since the Blues were in power. And Sadiq Khan will look a little more than a little silly when he hits 6% of his target. Yep, that's 6% of the target, not 6% off. So what are the drivers here? Well, very low sales rates, under 6,000 new homes sold in the first 9 months of 2025 in London. Looks a bit like a rerun of the reasoning behind the Zoopla report on viability I discussed a couple of weeks back. At prices up to £600 a foot, the level at which most London owner-occupiers can buy, sales to individuals are virtually non-existent. If they can afford it, they don't want to buy it, and or unless it is expensive enough to be viable, then it isn't affordable for many. There were fewer than 1,000 sales under £600 a foot in London of new builds in the first 9 months of this year, and fewer than 300 of those were to individuals, whether they were UK-based or overseas individuals. The rest is build to rent, bulk deals, and affordable switches where they've moved to affordable housing in order to move the product on, the developer has. So there's a nod to the loss of off-plan investors and how much that has contributed, because with early stage sales, schemes are shown to be viable and therefore financeable. Build to rent completions are about to plunge, which is the delayed lettuce effect actually. Construction of build to rent starts were decimated in 2023 and 2024. And so that hurts from 2027 onwards. Molly Orr sees higher rents and more overcrowding. I expect more of the latter than the former because affordability is already squeezed quite so much in London. 3,248 starts in Q1 to Q3, and the target is 66,000. Perhaps I was being too generous to Sadiq Khan there, because the target's 88,000 for the year, so 66,000 in the first 3 quarters of the year. That's actually only 4.9% of the target, or a miss by 95.1. Now, there's time to squeeze in the issues that the building safety regulator are causing. 1 in 6 projects are halted, usually for one of 2 reasons. Either the main contractor's gone bust, or the sales market's just too weak. Completions look to halve in 27-28 compared to an already incredibly limp 25-26. Prices are not falling per se, which the data backs up. The reality is they absolutely are in inflation-adjusted terms, of course, but the rental market backup offers a second out here rather than discounting. Under construction sold versus unsold sits at 50%, which Molly Orr describes as healthy. Above £1,000 a square foot, less than 50% is sold, but it doesn't look terrible until it gets over £1,500 a square foot. Then we're talking really prime stuff, yeah? And presumably that isn't moving because the wealthy don't fancy putting themselves in Rachel's crosshairs anytime soon. The other reason for not discounting is that margins simply don't allow it in this day and age. Mollyall writes off 50% of London because their area is under £650 a foot. So they say even with free land, and if there was no SIL, no Section 106, no affordable contribution, it cannot work with development costs where they are today in London. This all leads to 920 residential developments, 281,000 unbuilt homes that have got permission. That's private plus affordable. They've got outline, detailed and unbuilt phases of schemes currently underway. So let's be clear, that number would never be zero, right? But it still seems a huge number in context of the rest of the numbers that we're mentioning here, especially as planning permission doesn't last in perpetuity, right? Unless it's extant, of course, you've started the build, in which case it does. But the Venn diagram, as Mollyall sees it, the sweet spot is buildings under 18 metres that are above £650 a foot. That's about 10,000 homes. 54% of unbuilt permissions are in schemes under £650 a foot. Developments above 18 metres, however, account for 90% of the unbuilt permissions. What a picture this paints. As it says within the Mollyall report text, and I've already said, I expect overcrowding first and rent rises second, but they will keep moving upwards alongside wage inflation, I'm sure, depending on the rest of the cost of living, of course. Centre for Policy Studies also released a report in this past week that prefers to call London the city that doesn't build. They cite a building rate that is below 25% of the rate throughout the rest of England. Why? Fairly simple as they see it. Median home is 11.5 times the median London salary. I don't like this comparison because there's such a stark contrast between the salaries of homeowners and renters. But look, apples with apples, 7.6 times is the number across England, whereas the ONS threshold of affordability is 5 times, which has been discussed in recent weeks. And that's where it is in Scotland and Wales, right? So average London property sells at £667 per foot. So we're very close to that Mollyall number here. And then London has an incredibly low vacancy rate, which is contrary to a lot of belief out there on the street. There are fewer than 1% of London homes that are long-term vacant, whereas the average vacancy rate across the OECD is about 10%. London has the highest level of overcrowding across all of England, of course. The average private renter is spending 40 to 50% of their income on rent in London. And then London has the fewest homes per capita of any British region and is far below the average in France, Germany and Spain. Homes England estimates that increasing London's housing stock by 5% would decrease housing costs by 10% and raise economic productivity by 3.1%. Doesn't sound a lot, 5%, does it? But it's actually a huge, huge number when you think about how many homes already exist in London. But anyway, London housing starts at 0.12 starts per 1,000 people. Compare that to the East Midlands, where there were 0.79 starts per 1,000 people in the first quarter of this year. Centre for Policy Studies describe this as a slow-motion tragedy, which I think is a very powerful and accurate phrase. Sadiq Khan has actually done a fairly average job, although his promises for things like 88,000 starts don't help him. And the massive drop-off in completions all coincides with the time of the lettuce, COVID, Building Safety Act, but he's never moved the needle to anywhere near where it was when Boris was mayor, I'm afraid. And he's done nothing to actually mitigate any of this, it doesn't seem. I never see him talking about it. I see him talking about targets, I see him talking about what's needed, and I see him, by implication, blaming developers privately for being too greedy, essentially not building enough affordable. Just the wrong way to go about solving this problem, right? Anyway, Centre for Policy Studies highlights 6 root causes. The macro environment, I agree, I've already said that, but where's the policy to tackle it? Building safety regulator and the second staircase requirements, same again, misguided, will hurt things for years to come before it's finally repealed when nothing's getting built. Excessive affordable housing requirements, the solution, according to Rayner, put them up. Misguided policies in the London plan, direct responsibility of the mayor, right? Lack of industrial intensification, which is a new one on me, I must say, and poor use of opportunity areas, which we'll get into, right? So the macro, building cost inflation up 21% between 2021 and 2023. Interest rates, gilt yields are too high to bother borrowing to build. Increased cost of building and capital is a lethal cocktail. Housing starts are down 10% in England, but 73% in London over the past year. It seems very clear to me that the blockage in the above 18 metre space is the key factor here, right? Because of this new gateway system, 69% have been rejected for gateway 2, which is still pre-construction, right? 92% of 193 buildings are held up by the building safety regulator with a median waiting time of 36 weeks. How can you possibly deal with that as a business? Gateway 3 takes about 4 months currently, but it's only been very lightly tested because not many have got past Gateway 2 to get to Gateway 3. Some have had delays over 18 months. This is completed and empty before people can move in. The risk management looks all wrong. The risk is old buildings and overcrowding. By scuppering new buildings, that risk goes up, not down, because it causes yet more overcrowding in yet more old buildings. Building safety regulator is in a no-win scenario. It gets nothing from approving a building, but everything to lose when approving a building if there was an unrecognised fault down the line. People are still looking for people to blame for Grenfell, of course. And we know about all of this if we've watched the documentaries and looked into it and all the rest of it. Now, look, let's qualify this. The CPS is a centre-right think tank, right? But it is an influential one. They also directly inform right to buy. Look what happened there, which was not all bad, but the lack of replacement should never have been countenanced. Anyway, let's bear in mind the second staircase requirement in France, Germany and Ireland is buildings above 50 metres. The official impact assessment showed a cost of the regulation overall would be 294 times the benefit. And yes, I'm being serious. In a 70-year modelling period, having a second staircase in a building between 18 and 50 metres in height did not save one single life. The cost-benefit ratio between 18 and 50 metres is actually 1,200 to 1. Where can you even start with that? Remember Rachel and her cutting unnecessary regulation to promote growth? And I'm pretty sure Mr. Starmer said that as well. But look, let's be fair here. This is a Michael Gove legacy, which was a knee-jerk response to Grenfell, which is causing this slow-motion car crash, hurting hundreds of thousands of people, but insidiously, invisibly, and slowly. How about affordable? Well, fast-track approval for sites with 35% affordable, or 50% if on industrial or public land was the offer. The old money percentages were between 22 and 26% in Boris's good old days, when still nowhere near enough housing was being built in London, but it looks wonderful compared to the current environment. If the developer doesn't accede to the 35% plus, then they face a challenge at the end, which might mean surrendering any unexpected upside. It's a bit of a classic Labour case at the moment. Higher taxes don't necessarily get you where you want to be. Usually you want them to create revenue for the government or the local authority. But the tax here is creating more affordable units for social good, right? But like all taxes, go too high and behaviour changes. What happens here? Well, people stop building. No new builds, no ripple effects. They cite a Finnish study, actually, which showed 55% of the benefits of market rate housing reaching households in the bottom half of the income distribution. And 36% of the benefits reach the bottom 20%. So there's social mobility beneficial as well. They use a case study, which is always good in these situations, of the Stag Brewery in Mortlake, closed late 2015. 850 homes approved in 2020, 17% affordable, called in by the mayor. Too low. 1,250 were then asked for with 30% affordable. No, rejected in 2021, too high, too much scale. The updated plan now, 1,075 homes with 7.5% affordable. Absolute genius. And only 6 viability reviews during construction to come. Honestly, who would be a developer? An upside-only bet for the local authority or the government. But the behaviour change here is that fewer people play the game because there are better, safer and more financially rewarding games elsewhere. 347 affordable homes were started in the capital in the first quarter of this financial year, with CIL and Section 106 at between 5 and 15% of GDV. Holy moly. As far as the misguided policies go, this reminds me of a bad tax planning scheme of which some readers and listeners will be far too aware for comfort. Nevertheless, I'm going to use the analogy. 113 different policies that sound perfectly sensible on their own and even have precedent, but mix them all together with no idea what the actual outcome will be and who bears all the risk? The buyer of the scheme, in this case, the developer. Another classic appears here: make advisory space standards mandatory in London. The average renter can only afford 25 square metres of space according to CPS, but 37 square metres for one person or 50 square metres for two is mandatory. You couldn't make it up. It's all a complete lie, and this is how you end up with 4 people in a 1-bedroom flat, which is most certainly not uncommon, as I'm sure many experienced heads in London property could confirm. What about the lack of industrial intensification? Well, there's a 640 hectare site next to Old Oak Common, which is called Park Royal. You'll have heard of Old Oak Common because that's where HS2 is going to end because they can't get it into Euston, isn't it? That's surrounded by 11 tube stations, but building homes on the site is effectively banned, according to CPS. It's like they're doing it deliberately. I don't believe that they are. I believe this is just incompetence. They are too incompetent to be deliberate about anything, but I felt exactly the same about Boris during the pandemic. But anyway, don't worry, there'll be a new London plan by 2027-28, just in time for the next election, do you suppose? How about the opportunity areas identified in the 2021 plan? 47 of them, with potential for at least 2,500 new homes or 5,000 new jobs. Great work identifying these. Then, of course, you've got to deliver them. Delivery in these areas, it's actually fallen. 5,500 homes in opportunity areas were completed in 2024 compared to 20,000 in 2019. Why? Well, 14 flats in the Lee Valley North opportunity area took a 1,250-page planning application, and then more than 1 year into the process, no planning has been granted. The conclusion, ultimately, this needs urgent attention. The unsaid part that's clear to me, so I'm going to say it, is that it won't get it. It will limp along and get even worse before the next set of promises that won't happen. London's housing customer experience will get far worse yet, and until there's a huge change, it won't improve organically. The situation is literally a zugzwang. Moving out of London to key cities, 25 mid-sized UK towns and cities, a cross-party network, they've also produced a report on turbocharging house building. I'm not sure whether to laugh or cry at this stage, but these key cities and towns are the Lincolns, the Plymouths, the Wolverhamptons, the Salfords and the Stoke-on-Trents of the world. Wales is represented by Newport and Wrexham. Where does their report get to? Well, where I started when I commented on planning permission changes when they were first announced. A great start, but lots of other problems blocking delivery. It's only taken 16 months or so for the authorities to catch up to the blindingly obvious to industry insiders, which was roughly the timescale I expected. Now it's more about viability and funding barriers. No, it always was as well. Sure, help with planning, but why are unbuilt sites sitting, right? High remediation costs, skill shortages, limited council powers and funding. That's what the Key Cities report says. What do they want? £3 billion Land and Infrastructure Viability Fund to unlock stalled brownfield and grey belt sites. Now, it could easily be a positive net present value, a reasonable investment case there. Support for SME builders with simplified planning and VAT rules for sites under 100 homes. Well, it's ambitious, but well done for calling it. A fairer definition of affordable rent. They want 130% of social rent, which is social is normally about 50% of rents. So that would be 65% of market rather than up to the 80% of market, which normally ends up at 80% of market. I mean, that's a nice idea, but it's not going to help with viability, is it, for build to rent and things like that, or for housing associations buying the affordable stock. It's a fair call for the tenants because often 80% really isn't affordable these days. But flex rent, as Granger would call it, or what Darren Rodwell calls the community rent model, you'd be about 1 million times better off. And that needs to be implemented, that sort of solution. But I've said that lots of times before. All that falls on deaf ears, especially as Darren's been nudged out of the Labour Party under shocking circumstances, quite frankly, from what I hear anyway. But more devolved powers which are coming, we're told, or were coming before reform started winning so many local authority seats. I'm a huge cynic here as to whether devolution is really going to happen once reform have got control of many, many more councils in England and Wales. But then they want higher energy, space and accessibility standards. I mean, really, we've got to be convinced of the cost-benefit analysis here if viability is a problem. Making stuff bigger is not going to help, right? 90% of the key cities and towns report a critical shortage of affordable housing. Remember, this isn't large urban centres, right? Salford and Wolverhampton are about as big as they get. And of course, they've got proximity to Manchester and Birmingham, respectively. But there's also some successful case studies. Derive in Salford, Goldsmith Street in Norwich, 40 homes in Stoke, and the Holes Bay regeneration in Poole. Learning from what we've done well in other places around the country is critical, right? Now, we're talking about 10% of the UK's urban population outside London here. These cities and towns in this report contribute £150 billion to GDP. So it's a bit more than 5% of the total. But the point is, if they're having problems at their size, it puts the problems we're having in London, into context, doesn't it? Significantly. So it seems like lobbying week, really, because we've just finished conference season. Next up, it's Savills' turn with a research report for LPDF. That's the Land Planning and Development Federation. You might not have heard of them. I hadn't, as they haven't been around for that long. In context, 2018. Why do they exist? To bring together land promoters, strategic developers and others who specialise in bringing forward decent-sized chunks of land for housing and or mixed-use development. What are they arguing for? A new equity loan scheme for buyers. Let's call it Help to Buy 2.0, because that's what it is. How do they frame it? New home sales in 2025 have collapsed to their lowest levels since the Great Financial Crisis. I warned this back in 2023, when developers still managed to push new build prices upwards, whilst the rest of the market retreated about 3%. That created about 5% of overperformance against the secondary market, which was just unjustified, and it was always going to catch up at some stage. It's probably more likely because the first-time buyer is just not as sophisticated. But as they start to stretch, as the surveyors stop playing ball, as Bank of Mum and Dad get involved in those decisions and all the rest of it, never going to be a sustainable path. SME builders are hit the hardest because they can't deal with the slow sales rates. They're more likely to be using leverage, and the increased project finance costs are also higher anyway because SMEs have to pay more money. They pay more of a premium for their money. You can't argue with any of that. And on the ground, I talk to people who are halfway through or thereabouts selling sites between 5 and 55 units and are being scuppered by backed up and overturned development financing, watching their profits seep away. As we know from months of analysis of the real-time market, larger homes and higher prices sites are selling particularly slowly. I say particularly in the southeast, but I'm not sure that's right. There's just a lot more of them in the southeast, but diplomatically, it's hard to see the 1.5 million homes being achieved. I mean, hard. It's just impossible. Savills' own forecasts are under 900,000 for this parliament, as we've discussed before. So Help to Buy 2.0 for new builds only, please. That's what they want. Smaller deposits, cheaper mortgage rates. Not sure that was ever the case. Lower loan-to-income ratios and an interest-free period of 5 years. Well, you might as well ask for the whole cake rather than just cut a slice, right? What's the carrot? Helping households who are locked into renting and helping families get suitably sized homes. Bit of a laugh on the basis of some of the sizes of new build homes these days, but okay. It does fit with the overcrowding argument that I already used, right? So we'll let it slide. Their analysis suggests there could be another 100,000 new home sales for first-time buyers by March 2029, stabilising things, enabling quick expansion of house building capacity. So basically what they're saying is, government, listen, you can't hit your target without doing this. We don't really think you'll hit it if you do it, but at least you've definitely shown that you've tried. Also, the suggestion that this could turn the fortunes of SME builders. Well, that seems unlikely, really, when you think last time out, the biggest players were the biggest beneficiaries, of course. But if you were minded like that, you could always do it on sites of fewer than 30 homes or fewer than 100 homes, for example. Equity loans are mostly repaid within 5 to 10 years if they go forward with the plan proposed. Mostly. In fairness, they do also try to address much of the old critique of Help to Buy 1.0, for example, price inflation and excess house builder profits. So they suggest price controls indexed to local values. Sounds a bit surprisingly non-market forces to me. First-time buyers only being targeted will help, but will it? With conditions on affordable housing delivery, which is a good idea, right? Carrot for that stick. UK supply chain usage, difficult to enforce, I'd imagine, and apprenticeships and workforce expansion. That works in a time of rising unemployment and desperate skill shortages. But overall, the push is for something simplistic that appeals widely. They suggest avoiding mortgage guarantees because they don't reduce repayment costs. They don't reduce loan-to-income limits, and they don't prioritise new builds. We've got to have a little time out here, though, folks, because ultimately, when I talk about the swap rates and the gilt rates week in, week out, as I do, anyone who sees when I also talk about the mortgage rates on residential, which I do occasionally because they're relevant, not really relevant to us as investors, but they are relevant, the sharp will notice that, largely speaking, the best price mortgages in the market are normally at the 5-year swap rate. Now, what does that mean when you think about it? It means there's no margin in that whatsoever. In fact, it costs money to deliver for the bank, so there's a loss. there's a loss there. Yes, there are arrangement fees and things like that, but all the incentives they give away to get these people in as clients, they are loss leaders to get people in as clients. They might make some money if they go on to their variable rate at the end of that 2-year fix or 5-year fix, sure thing. They're hoping to get other banking services from them. Right? They are subsidised already. So you are not going to get those mortgage rates down anymore without costing significant money to the taxpayer. And I'm not really sure there's a proper argument for being able to do that. But I don't blame them. I don't blame them for trying. They're trying to do a job here. So let's crack on anyway. But that just needs to be said, I think. Now, they don't like mortgage guarantees because they don't prioritise new builds. And so they're not helping to boost the housing supply, is their argument. And also the take-up of the mortgage guarantee schemes has been tiny compared to the equity loan schemes. But their timing is wonderful, let's face it. The Housing Ministry must be seeing these reports, and it's their biggest kick in the teeth so far. What about IMLA, the Intermediary Mortgage Lenders Association? They also released their September market briefing, and I wanted to squeeze that in as well, because there's a couple of bits in there that I haven't seen said anywhere else. So firstly, they believe the market recovery after stamp duty changes is already complete after a solid July. That included 39 billion quid in product transfers. Now, they're not measured in the Bank of England's money and credit report. They only look at remortgages when you move to a different lender, not product transfers. That is the all-time record. Also, high loan-to-value lending that month rose to 7.8% of the lending book. That's loans over 90% loan-to-value. That's the highest since 2008. I always feel nervous if I type that sentence, but this time I don't see any cause for concern. Buy-to-let lending is also reported as repairing significantly, which we knew. But buy-to-let mortgage demand was at an incredible low. It's a shame UK Finance have changed the way they present their data, because it's now a lot harder to follow than it was before. I love these improvements with what's really important publicly available data on refreshes of websites that probably cost tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds. They're just brilliant, aren't they? So they finish with a little speculation. Confidence in investment in property might improve if long-term yields ease post-budget. Will that happen? Big decisions for Rachel Reeves, that's for sure. Two more in what was a fantastic week for reporting. One sector I cover very rarely because I have limited interest in it for long-term strategic reasons, and that is the student market. However, I couldn't ignore this Cushman & Wakefield report. Their UK student accommodation report was released in the past week. It's the takeaways that caught the eye. Well, the report is 90 pages long, and so here are the takeaways. 2.8 billion transacted in the first 9 months of 2025. Sustained appetite during tighter credit conditions is a fair summary. It isn't like the mid-2010s and the cheap money days, but it is a good recovery from 2023. Student visa issuances fell 30.8% in 2024 in the end, so no wonder the sector was carnage in certain areas. But 2025 is on track for a 7% plus rebound, robust, particularly in the Red Brick and Russell Group cities. Next up was the one stat that really caught my eye though. University managed accommodation rents grew 4.44% in 2025. The private sector's student rents grew 1.16%. So for the first time in 7 years, university managed accommodation rents outstripped the private sector's rents. But that doesn't strike me as sustainable either. It's more of a knee-jerk response to increased costs, inflation, energy prices, and the likes. For the whole year, they're expecting just under 4 billion in volumes in terms of new build student development. So not as much as 2024, but not bad in terms of transacted. That means, rather than just new build. However, the universities were ready as they knew the student volumes were down and were better at filling their own stock. So the private sector had to compete on price and pronto whenever they caught up with the trend. The lower tier stock, which would be 1990s to 2000s PBSA blocks, which are old by international standards and old in the context of the history of PBSA, saw rents up 4.14%. Prime new build rents fell 0.98%, which is a flight to affordability, it seems. But like everywhere, the collar rents have performed well. Average price per operational bed, £100,000, notably below the cost for a new unit. So it won't surprise you to hear that Cushman & Wakefield say that new schemes are financially unviable without subsidy or discount land. This is constraining the development pipeline, and indeed CBRE has suggested there will be a huge shortage of PBSA by 2030 on the back of this. Postgrads fell by 9.7%, more losses this year, suspected to be about 17.3% down from the peak when the visa rules changed. Undergraduate looks much more resilient, and that's moved upwards by 2.8 for 2025-26. Yields, which I never understand in PBSA, they look far too low to interest me, and that's why I've never got involved, hold at 4.25% for prime London and 5.25% for super prime regional. Occupancy in Manchester, Bristol and Glasgow is at 98% or more, all are undersupplied. 17% of all beds and 24.4% of private stock are priced above the maximum maintenance loan now. That's from 3.7% in 2016 to 17, and once again is a warning about sustainability in my view. This is dramatic affordability erosion. At this rate though, if numbers only grow 1% annually, there'll be 1.9 students per bed by 2030 to 31 due to the nature of the market at the moment. A lot of transferable stories to the wider market here, but if development isn't viable, what are you supposed to do about it? Well, last report then before I get onto the Bank of England efforts for the week, a sector I'm more involved in and lean into a little more on a monthly basis. The ageing population. Age UK discussed how the shortage of suitable housing affects our ageing population. We saw earlier on that the increased numbers in temporary accommodation are actually over 65s in the past year. Let's see what the experts have to say. So generally, it might not surprise you to hear the core message is that the housing system is failing the ageing population as well. Millions are unable to move and or live in properties that make ageing harder, putting more pressure on the NHS, social care and local authority budgets. So there's an economic case for sorting this out alongside a moral one. They address the big assumption up front. Older people do move more than assumed. Nearly half of those aged 66 to 74 have moved since turning 50, but most don't find homes suited to ageing. 59% of 75 plus never expect to move again. Barriers are practical, emotional and financial. 44% of over 50s worry about affordability, 41% worry about condition, and 43% worry about accessibility. But what would be suitable? Well, step-free, warm, efficient, adaptable, close to amenities. Only 12% of households over 75 have step-free access, and 2.3 million over 55s live in non-decent homes. What that means, it doesn't meet the 4 criteria in the decent home standard, to be clear. Next up, it won't surprise you to hear that those in the PRS and those with low incomes, which correlate, are hit the hardest. 65% of private renters above 66 have affordability concerns, and 48% of 66 plus homeowners with incomes under 30k worry about the condition of their properties. Adaptations take nearly a year to deliver under the Disabled Facilities Grant process, which is a major barrier to independent living. Again, it won't surprise you to hear that women, carers and ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected here. Lower lifetime earnings, longer life expectancies and tenure inequality are all cited. But anyway, on to what's different. Over 90% of older people live in mainstream homes, so specialist schemes remain exactly that. Under-occupation is overstated according to this report because 80% of over 65s already live in a 3-bedroom house or smaller. Now, this just demonstrates a vast misunderstanding of what houses we're short of in the UK, apart from anything else. Very, very obvious issue with that statement. When you've got 3 bedrooms and you only need 1, that is the dictionary definition of significant under-occupation. 2 spare bedrooms, right? But this report wants to talk about usability, not size. So, too few homes are accessible, adaptation is too slow, retrofit planning is insufficient. Then another one of those head-wobbling stats. By 2043, households headed by over 65s will make up 84% of all new household growth. Wow. The argument here, though, is that the problem is accelerating. So what's needed, according to this report? Well, age-friendly design should be a national housing priority. National planning policy framework needs amending to require explicit assessment of ageing needs. Mandate Part M4.2, accessibility standards for new homes. Oh, fantastic. More regulation. You'll see where this is incongruent with many of the other reports. Social housing renovation needs to embed accessibility and energy efficiency. Remember, social's way ahead of PRS or owner-occupier stock. 75+% is C+, versus just under 50% in the other tenures. Integrate retrofit and adaptation policy. Sounds like a sensible idea. Reform the Disabled Facilities Grant. Ensure older renters are protected from rising energy costs, fund local enforcement and expand home improvement agencies nationwide, and regenerate sheltered housing to boot. You'll see just how much of this is about more bureaucracy and more regulation, and it's just unlikely to achieve anything, and that remains to be the problem. The evidence is overwhelming that development is nearly regulated out of all existence at this time. I don't think what Labour had in mind with their 1.5 million homes was to make it so hard that only massive developers or local authorities could build, but that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment, right? And that's could build, not are building, for the reasons that I've already been into. So all of the solutions here pretty much make it harder. That's not to knock the ageing population. Look, everybody's ageing ultimately, right? Or age UK, but more the attitude of the way we think we should go about things in the UK right now. I'd like to see a lot more about the economic argument of how do we save the NHS and the social care system money, and allocating that money via grants rather than excessive regulation, personally, and I think it would be a lot more effective. I said it last week. More and more I read these reports and realise how they just don't actually understand how to get things done, which is frustrating because the cause is a just one. But economics does not have room for the moral argument because resources are scarce and they're all being spent in the wrong areas all the time at the moment, it seems. But okay, that's an absolutely damning assessment across the board of the new build situation throughout the country, not just London, although goodness me, it looks more to than London. Although London is what actually attracts the attention of Westminster in terms of shaping the experience of the decision makers, right? It's also handily disposable in terms of the mayoral authority. And I think we all know there's limited warmth between Calne and Starmer, I think it's fair to say. But smaller cities, housing for the ageing population, first-time buyers, everybody's screaming to an extent, and everybody is, as always, pushing their own agendas for the groups that they represent, because that's politics. How about one of the key variables mentioned in dispatches here, the interest rate in general? There appears, to me, to be even more divergence forming between members of the Monetary Policy Committee, based on speeches from the past couple of weeks. The committee meets again on Thursday, the 6th of November, and it's the last significant meeting of the year with the updated Monetary Policy Report. Changing rates on a non-report meeting has not happened for over 2 years now, when we were on the up in terms of the interest rate cycle, and indeed when 5-year bonds hit their high for this cycle, which was June 2023. I perhaps don't need to remind you, but I will. The last 2 cuts that have happened were both 5-4 cuts. The last consensus cut, and one of those was a tiebreaker, if you remember, it was 4-4-1, and Alan Taylor had to be persuaded to move from down 0.5% to down 0.25%. The last consensus cut, we could really call it, was back in February this year when the vote was 7-2. November 24 was also 5-4, and August 2024, the first cut, was a 6-3 vote. And remember, the February vote wasn't 7-2, it was 9-0, really. The 2 that disagreed voted for a 0.5% cut, not a 0.25% cut. We've only had one consensus cut, one whitewash consensus cut in this cycle, right? So there's plenty of resistance at the most recent stages when it comes to rate cuts. Plenty who think we shouldn't be cutting the rates at all on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. So you might think, perhaps don't worry too much about it when those four people are saying or doing. They're in the minority, right, when they do agree to cut. Well, I also wrote some months ago about the first divergence for many years between the governor and the deputy governor for monetary policy. You get the overall sense this whole thing is really, really marginal, right? There are good arguments on both sides and there's significant fragility, which there is. So the next meeting is before the budget in 2024. It was after the budget, this equivalent meeting, right? There's yet one more reason to hold off on cutting the rates, to be honest, because the markets are quite openly nervous, in my view. They can't be blamed for that. Ultimately, Rachel Reeves has not yet won the trust of households or businesses in the round, primarily because of her actions in the 2024 budget. And again, she's going to break some promises in the 2025 budget, promises not to raise taxes again. So where's her credibility going to be, right? Another pattern, though, if you want to look for patterns, the last 5 meetings have been accompanied by a refreshed policy report that have all ended in a cut. So therefore, you think this one will be a cut as well. But I don't think so. In recent months, inflation has ticked upwards. We've got September's number coming up, and it's widely accepted it's going to be quite ugly. The Economist's best guess is 4% for CPI and 3.7% for core CPI. I think it starts with a 4 for sure, and I'd be betting upside, not downside on that. Just 1 year ago, September 2024 CPI printed 1.7. Whilst that was a little fluky or down to the base effects, 4 point something feels a world apart from that. Anyway, I'm going to do you a quick reminder of the players on the Monetary Policy Committee. You can put Dingra and Taylor together, both externals, both committed doves. They basically vote downwards whenever there's a meeting. You then got Dave Ramsden, who's an internal bank employee. He's the Deputy Governor for Markets. He's proven to be the next most dovish. He can certainly be persuaded to lean towards a cut. Then the in-betweeners, we're not talking about briefcase here, the Governor, which is the right position for the Governor to have, in my view. Lombardelli, and also Sarah Breeden, Deputy Governor for Financial Stability. Then you'd have to have Catherine Mann next, because she has switched positions. She hadn't voted for a big cut before. She was up for cutting by 0.5% before. Then Megan Green, I think, who's more hawkish but can be moved to a cut potentially. And then the most hawkish is Hugh Pilt, the chief economist, who should really be one of the most very influential on the committee. His only vote to cut has been February 2025. So what have they all been saying? And how does that start to form our expectations for 2026 and beyond? By the way, it doesn't mean that Hugh Pilt didn't want to cut at all. He did want to cut, but he wanted to wait a bit longer. That's effectively that manifesting itself, right? So in the last few weeks, all the committee members have been making a lot of speeches. So if we start with the committee doves, you've heard exactly what you'd expect. Taylor is warning of a bumpy landing if inflation falls below target too soon. I just don't think the man is looking at core inflation at the moment. I mean, Dhingra doesn't want us to be overly cautious in cutting rates. She sees many inflation drivers as temporary, and so faster cuts can be justified. I've got to pause at this point because I don't normally tear into the members of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, but I think that's utter nonsense, right? Both of the aforementioned are genuinely proper economists, right? Not like me. They're preeminent, they're incredibly well qualified. But look at the evidence. Wage rises are still nearly 5%. 5% including bonus in the figures this week, in spite of us being told they'd be under 4% by the end of this year. And in the face of redundancies and rising unemployment, they're still where they are. Construction inflation is expected to be 16% or above by the end of this decade. And pull the other one, it's definitely going to be higher than that. Look at the extra regs in the pipeline, including future homes, for example. So it's not just about inflation on existing materials, bear in mind, but that's 16% number is just on existing materials, right? And if you factor in labour into that, of course, the way things are looking at the moment, 16% within 5 years, you're joking, aren't you? Realistically, it's going to be more than that, isn't it? Then utilities have been all over the press in the past week. Miliband is just continuing to lie about energy bills coming down when all of the main players in the industry are saying 20% plus rises by the end of 2029 are basically guaranteed. Food inflation is going to be between 5 and 6% by the end of this year, they think, and core inflation in general is nowhere near a 2% world. Where's this quick drop in inflation coming from, Alan, unless we're going to have a recession? Right. I don't think we're likely to have one yet, by the way, either, because we need a catalyst at this point. There has been disappointing economic performance, sure. Growth is lower than we would like. Tax is higher than we would like. Unemployment isn't doing well, although a decent chunk is coming from falling inactivity, which is rarely cited, as I've said, but not in the past 3 months or so. Government spending, however, is driving growth, and consumption spending is being driven by wage rises, especially in the public sector. Right, public sector employees are lower paid, according to common opinion, but actually it's pretty close these days. 34,500. There was a survey in the middle of last year, a study by the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, had 34,500 as the median in the public sector and 36,000 as the median in the private sector. Far, far more generous pensions and getting bigger pay rises at the moment as well, but most of these pay rises are spent in volume, particularly the ones that go to the lower paid, because as we say in economics, their marginal propensity to consume, which is how much of their extra money that they actually spend, is always much higher. Whereas if you give a very wealthy person a £5,000 a month pay rise, it probably just gets saved, realistically. They probably don't expand their lifestyle accordingly. So that's the proper committed doves out of the way anyway. What about Ramsden? He says wage growth is normalising. Well, okay, Dave, it is down from the 7% days, but we haven't seen a lot of progress this year. Not that I want it or advocate for it to be below inflation. We're looking at 1%-ish in real terms at the moment, and we want 1 to 2% sustainably in order to improve living standards. But the problem, my friend, is that it's only 1 to 2% in real terms because inflation is too high. His lean towards dovishness is likely to manifest in voting to hold in November, in my view, and that's the right play. I don't think there's enough for him to vote downwards. So Lombardelli hasn't been particularly vocal, and she seems to prefer data to ideology, so I like her already. Bailey has come out and said rate cuts are still expected, but with a timing and pace that is less certain. And like I said, you've had 5 report meetings in a row and you've had 5 cuts. So he's basically saying he's not voting downwards this time, in my opinion. It sounds like a bit of a hawkish lean. He knows that policy needs to stay restrictive. That means rates stay higher until inflation is retained sustainably to target. He's also quite good at dismissing some of the less certain trends, such as higher long-term gilt yields. The tragedy is, however, that he doesn't link this with his horrifically misguided quantitative tightening bank policy that I went into in serious detail last week. Andrew, look, 2 + 2 is 4. Breeden next doesn't want to keep rates too high for too long, does it? Will harm output and employment. Well, that's already happening anyway, right? But again, she refers to a temporary bump, not a sustained trend. In my view, in the complete face of the facts, but I'm going to go on a bit more about that in a bit. In many ways, what they all seem to be missing is a real long-term macro view that should be being influenced significantly in the aftermath of the pandemic. They're not alone here. There's nearly no one that wants to listen to me bang on about COVID and the aftermath anymore. At least half of this is psychological, in my opinion. People had a tough time. They want to put it behind them. They want to forget it. However, it is underlying the root cause of much of the structural inflation that is now embedded within the system. The very structural inflation that everybody knew, other than Andy Haldane, when he was the chief economist. They all totally denied the existence of it, apart from Andy, right? Instead of preferring the narrative I debunked for the nonsense that it was at the time, transitory inflation. The gag, as good as it gets for property economists, dad jokes anyway, was that everything is transitory. It might just take 30 or 40 years to get through it. Right now, we're having some more transitory inflation thanks to Rachel Reeves' raising of employers' national insurance. It forced prices upwards, but it was also a one-off, although it appears to be a one-off for the year rather than forever. So this can also be written off as transitory. Here's the problem. We were already struggling with core inflation, and so anything inflationary has a bigger impact than it would do if we were at a steady state. We've never been at a core inflation steady state since 2021. The cycle low is 3.2% for core CPI since September 2021. No one seems to mention this. 4 years above the upper bound for acceptability for the key metric, and a completely sideways and slightly upwards, in fact, trend for core inflation in 2025. Now, here's where I get frustrated. I'm not suggesting this is obvious, but this is exactly the sort of helicopter view a macroeconomist should be taking, no? Throw into the mixer that all the macro data we have on pandemics in history show a 1% premium on inflation over the following 30, 40 years. And we're back to one of my more famous soapboxes of modern times. We live in a 3% inflation world, and pretending otherwise is a nonsense. Anyway, finishing the roundup with the more sensible members of the Monetary Policy Committee. Megan Green, I agree with more than anyone else. Although I've got a lot of respect for Hugh Pill as well. Catherine Mann flip-flops a little bit too much for me, but I do admire her presence and her speeches more than the others, to be honest. Megan Green says inflation may be falling more slowly than expected, depends what you expected, I suppose, and warned about assuming productivity recovery in the past week, which is true but unhelpful, with an upcoming productivity review which is due in the OBR forecast, which is going to be incredibly important. Productivity is the number one most important factor to the growth forecast. It's as simple as that in the medium and long term. Mann, she moved from recommending a 0.5% cut in February, which is very American style, to being a holder once again. She sees no urgent need to cut rates just yet, so we know where she's at. Yes, the labour market is weaker, but not falling off a cliff. She also looks closely at inflation expectations because they inform behaviour. And she says policy must remain restrictive for longer to restore price stability. She's right. She has in recent months used phrases like persistent hold, and I think she's nailed it largely. But that leaves Hugh. He talks more of a slower pace of cuts and is talking about inflation becoming embedded. I think it already is, but I think he means more embedded, realistically. Inflation pressures are persistent, and they are, and expectations are now baked in, as Mann refers to. It takes a lot to change this, and it won't be fast. But remember, this all impacts the 2-year mortgage rate a fair bit more than the 5-year, because it's the short-term rate, the 3-month rate, that essentially is set by the Bank of England. The longer term is not so impacted at all by the base rate, but it's massively impacted by the QT policy. Sorry to mention quantitative tightening it one more time, but it is true. Rate expectations dropped this week for 1 year's time because the unemployment numbers were poor and the US bond yields dropped down to 3.5%. Right, so the rate expectation in a year's time is now 3.5%, I should say. That would be 2 cuts in the next 12 months of 0.25%, which looks maybe about right, or perhaps a little bit hopeful. I think I'd be about 1.5 cuts as at today, or maybe even closer to 1 cut actually, because I'm not convinced about inflation going away quietly, and I need to see something change that has not changed thus far in 2025 when it comes to the core. Okay, too many soapboxes, too little time. A real genuine well done this week if you got to the end of this. Are rates going to drop substantially in 2026? Well, it looks highly unlikely without a black swan. But there's a few swimming around these days, some of which the UK are in no control of whatsoever. But if you're still sitting and waiting for lower rates, do yourself a favour and sort out any variable rates that are hanging. So, as I draw this week to a close, the next workshop is prepared and we turn our eyes to 2026. We start the year with a bang, discussing strategic planning and how to get the most out of the next 12 months. With some of our own methods and our takes on productivity and time management alongside systems and processes. Now, the other half of the workshop is about the most common pain point in SME property businesses: accounts, bookkeeping and group accounting. This is about measuring asset performance, not how to use zero, but how to make the most of financial information. What should you be seeing monthly? How should you interpret it properly and use it strategically to grow your business safely but quickly? As always, we have real life case studies about our own experiences and close with our own no holds barred Q&A. Anything individual to consider? Get a VIP ticket and join us for dinner in a smaller setting with an opportunity to discuss any specific roadblocks or issues in your property business at the moment. Join us Thursday, 22nd of January 2026, Central London, bit.ly/PBW and a number 9, link in the show notes. But above all, please remember to keep calm, always listen to the supplement and carry on. There are opportunities abound this year and towards 2030 and beyond. The landscape has been set for a surefire bull run. It will be slowish and take a little while longer to get off the ground, and the amount of stock around is still keeping things suppressed at the moment. But as the market continues to improve slowly, it is a case of here we go, in my opinion. Thanks, folks.